It's in our nature to forget. Appointments, birthdays, where we last left our keys, and though it gets us in trouble sometimes, being able to forget is actually a good thing. No, really. As action-oriented creatures, our brains are designed to ensure we experience the world rather than memorize it. It allows us to enjoy the present instead of being caught up in the past. If we couldn't forget, we would never be able to process new sensations and enjoy life to the fullest. There's also another very important reason memory works the way it does. It allows the mind to heal. Think back to the pain you once felt when you lost a loved one, or that really nasty breakup. Now, imagine if you were forced to retain the emotional intensity of that pain in conscious memory all the time. Hurts, doesn't it? So instead, a healthy brain smooths away the edges until the memory of such trauma subsides and becomes easier to deal with. But what happens when the memory doesn't belong to any one person, but to a place? When that trauma is so deeply rooted that it seems to live on forever, in walls and floors and unexplainable encounters. Maybe it's then that we learn the uncomfortable truth, that no matter how hard our brains try to bury the past, it often finds ways to come screaming back out. Such a place existed in the city of Kuala Lumpur not too long ago, and some of you may even be familiar with it. Pudu Prison, a place steeped with history, and most of it is dark, even for prison standards. Executions, outbreaks of deadly disease, wartime torture, and suicide. For over 100 years, the prison was a home to unspeakable anguish and suffering, and its violent echoes could be heard right up until its walls came down. And many argue, beyond. My name is Joshua Tan. Welcome to Hantued. The origins of Pudu Jail cannot be separated from the birth of Malaysia's capital city, Kuala Lumpur. They share an intertwined history, and it all began, as with many things, the lust for wealth. In the mid-1800s, the confluence of the Klang and Gombak rivers drew the attention of prospectors for one of the most lucrative minerals of its age, tin. Over time, a settlement of just a few tin miners grew to a township of hundreds. But with the promise of great riches came great struggle for power. Violence erupted between royal Malay families who wanted control of the industry, as well as Chinese triads looking for their share of the riches. Gang fights escalated into civil war, with murder and bloodshed becoming all too common ways to resolve conflict. The large-scale fighting became a matter of concern for the British, who occupied large territories within Malaya at the time. Worried that the escalation of violence would disrupt their trade in the region, they intervened in local governing affairs. Their influence eventually led to a different approach to civil disobedience. Work would begin on a large prison to house criminals and dissenters to their rule. Construction of Pudu Jail began in 1891 and took 4 years to complete. With 600 cells, miles of concrete walls, and looming towers, it was one of the most modern prisons of its age, a brooding monument, testament to British power. But for all the foreboding that it might have inspired from the outside, nobody, not even its early administrators, could have been prepared for the horrors that would take place within. The prison's history of death started almost from the very beginning. In August 1895, just a few months after the prison's completion, a plague of cholera swept through the cells, killing hundreds of inmates, the very first ones to inhabit the jail. Even this devastating epidemic, however, was not as disturbing as how it came to be in the first place. You see, as cliché as this may sound, the site where the jail now stood was previously a Chinese cemetery, and its main water supply had been contaminated by bacteria feasting on the many buried corpses just beneath the floors. Even without the ever-present threat of fatal diseases, life in the prison was a daily struggle for survival. Its 600 cells were filled beyond capacity. as many as 15 inmates squashed into single tiny rooms. With most of them being members of various rival gangs, you can imagine how this was a recipe for disaster. Old grudges were reignited, and bloody fights and murders were an almost daily occurrence. Those who survived the physical challenges didn't always survive the mental ones. The appalling conditions pushed many to take their own lives, using towels as makeshift nooses to hang themselves from their window bars. Ken Wee, 32, handcuffed and escorted by 2 burly prison officers, was brought to a stop outside his new home, Cell 1 on death row. The block, consisting of 20 cells, was at full capacity. The inmates, themselves simply waiting for their date with death, responded to the newcomer's presence with malicious glee. "Welcome to hell," they laughed. "Last to arrive, first to die." Ken Wee, unfortunately, knew exactly what they were talking about. Cell 1 was infamous amongst the prisoners for being cursed. Its previous occupant, tired of waiting for his execution, had decided to take matters into his own hands, hanging himself from the prison bars, choking to death mere feet above the hard mattress Ken Wee would have to lie in every night. As he stepped into the small room, the metal door slamming shut behind him, the enormity of the death sentence settled onto his shoulders. Dread and exhaustion pulled Ken Wee down to the dusty floor. Days dragged into weeks, and Ken Wee had difficulty adjusting to his new life. Prisoners on death row were near uncontrollable. They shouted and screamed, cried and sang, banged against the doors until their hands were bruised and bloody. It was, by all accounts, hell on earth. Unlike the prison cells in the other blocks, death row rooms were designated to single occupants, and as overwhelmed as Ken Wee was, he couldn't quite shake another disturbing feeling: that he wasn't alone. On numerous nights, he felt watched from the darkest corners of the room. Sometimes he would spy an odd shadow that disappeared as soon as he blinked, and when he slept, a heaviness would press upon his chest, causing him to wake up gasping for breath. Thunder echoed around the stone walls. Lightning flashed, casting silhouettes from the outside world into Ken Wee's room. He jerked awake, disoriented. What time was it? 2 a.m? 3? He cursed. It was difficult enough to sleep on the calmest of nights, and a noisy storm would only serve to rile up the other inmates into yet another frenzy. Ken Wee kept his eyes closed, hoping that he could drift back to sleep. However, he was startled by an odd sensation that took him a moment to place. Drops of liquid on his face, coming from the ceiling. A leak from the rain? No, it stank, with an odor all too familiar to someone locked in a small box without proper means of relief. It was urine. His eyes flew open, and what he saw made him scream like he never had before. Above him, a man hung swaying from the ceiling, a noose around his bent neck. Eyes bulging, face purple, legs kicking violently. Urine dripped from his drenched prison uniform, and his mouth was moving, spitting words out in a horribly choked, raspy voice. The guards found Ken Wee catatonic the next morning. Unresponsive to their attempts to revive him, they were forced to call in the resident ustaz, an Islamic religious leader. A cleansing ceremony was held, and he was brought to a hospital where he gradually recovered. He was moved to a different cell, and never encountered anything like it again. However, like most stories from Pudu prison, this doesn't have a happy ending. Ken Wee himself met the same fate of his ghostly visitor 2 years later, hanged at the gallows after a failed appeal. Just another soul lost within the prison walls. The Japanese occupation of Malaya in the 1940s was a period of unspeakable horror for many, and the prison played host to many of the invaders' worst atrocities. It became a death camp for Allied forces as well as local citizens, and its British guardians were forced to experience the suffering they had overseen for nearly half a century. Dismemberment, beheadings, and waterboarding were daily sport, and indeed, in the years later, many have claimed to hear the anguished cries and screams of tortured souls. Corporal Yamaguchi was a Japanese soldier stationed at the prison during the occupation and had the added responsibility of being the building's electrician. He was in charge of maintaining the prison generator, making repairs when necessary. Like many dedicated soldiers, he took his job seriously, even setting up his living quarters just outside the generator room to guard it. A blackout one night threw the prison into disarray, and the corporal struggled to get the generator back up and running. It would prove to be his final job on duty, as he was electrocuted to death. A poetic end for the invader, all things considered, as he died trying to regain power. For years after his death, prison officers reported many unexplained occurrences in and around the generator room. Some have seen a shadowy apparition walking along the corridors, carrying a toolbox. Others have said that every so often, you could hear the old generator start up for a few seconds before stopping. Perhaps not even death itself could stop Yamaguchi's duty to his job and country. The Japanese are known for their admirable work ethic, after all. When foreign forces withdrew and Malaya gained independence in 1957, the land and its people moved forward into a golden era of development. The country of Malaysia was formed. Its first prime minister was elected through a democracy, and Kuala Lumpur grew into a modern metropolis. Yet, the prison's notoriety remained undiminished, a constant throughout time, unchanging despite the rapid growth happening all around it. Operations had resumed when the occupiers left, but living conditions were barely improved upon since it first opened its doors in 1895. Countless more prisoners were incarcerated, executed, and forced to endure the same inhumane environments that were considered cruel even before the turn of the century. The prison was finally closed in 1996 after 101 years of historic service, and parts of it were open to the public for visits. During that time, as you can probably imagine, it became a popular destination for ghost tours and paranormal investigators hoping to come away with their own scary experiences. And the scares were plentiful. Reports of unexplained voices, moving shadows, and footsteps were common. Even claims of more violent activity, including strangling, scratching, and possession. I'll leave you with just one more tale before we go, and you might be happy to know that it is one of Pudu Prison's most enduring ghost stories. It concerns Bilik Akhir, the final room in death row. It was called so as this was the place where condemned prisoners were brought to be read their last rites and to wait out their final few moments alone before their execution. The story goes that a woman had tried to commit suicide in the room by slitting her own throat. She was stopped before she could complete the act, but her execution could not be delayed, so she was simply picked up, bandaged, and marched out to complete her hanging. At the gallows, as the noose was tightened around her neck and the floor beneath her gave way, witnesses were presented with an unexpectedly gruesome display. The force of the drop tore open her wound, and her head was ripped from her shoulders. Her restless spirit has since been seen by officers, prisoners, and visitors alike. A headless body wandering the halls and corridors in and around the final room, perhaps looking for revenge on her executors, enraged at her violent death, or perhaps simply looking for her missing head. The stories I've shared with you today are just some of the hundreds that have been passed around by prisoners and guards for generations, and there are so many more. You probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that the prison had its own resident Pontianak, who sustained itself on the blood of inmates. There was a phantom fireball, said to be the ghost of a man who immolated himself, and even a relatively friendly spirit that would exchange winning lottery numbers for some eggs and fruit. In 2009, despite major public protests, demolition works began on the prison to make way for newer, fancier developments. New shopping malls and apartment blocks have been built upon the ruins, but it seems that the grounds have no intention of letting us forget and move on. 2 major structural collapses have occurred on and around the site. In 2014, a giant sinkhole opened up on the street just outside the prison grounds. In 2019, an entire floor of a new building collapsed during construction work. Fortunately, there were no reported casualties in either of those incidents, but it has reawoken public imagination. The more pragmatic of us would be quick to blame poor planning and workmanship, but there are others who insist that they were caused by something else. The restless dead, they will not be silenced, and they will always find a way to remind us that the past should not be so easily forgotten. Oh, and one more thing. If you were thinking, perhaps, of buying a fancy new apartment unit in Kuala Lumpur, I'd do a little research on its history and location first. You probably don't want to move into your new home, only to realize later that you aren't its only occupant. This episode of Hantued was written and produced by me, Joshua Tan, and features music by Mew. I would like to take this opportunity to apologize for making you wait for so long, and I really sincerely hope it was worth it. Thank you so much again for listening, and remember to stay safe and stay curious.